And without further ado, let me hand over to Kerry to introduce Rebecca. Kerry, over to you.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm not sure I agree with the comfort with Zoom and much less transatlantic Zoom, but I'm very, very delighted to be here, and it's lovely to see everybody. So Rebecca, Dr. Barr and I have a secret strategy here, which is to normalise the Northern Irish accent. So today, Rebecca is going to be talking to us about the good man on trial and male virginity and the politics of misogyny. Couldn't be more apt, I don't think. She's currently a lecturer at Jesus College, Cambridge in gender and sexualities, where she also did her PhD. Before that, Dr. Barr was at NY Galway for many years, where I know her from, and like many, people were sad to lose her. Rebecca has always been a model of good humour, collegiality, and sometimes hilarity in academia's often harsh environment. And we both hail from County Down, myself too, and so I put our extreme intelligence and charm down to the bracing sea air from there. Her forthcoming book is called Humouring Men, Gender, Laughter and Power in Mid-18th Century Fiction. It will reveal how humour's soft power insidiously disarms readerly objections. The novels that will be read render masculine power unserious and droll. Dominance is made palatable by the communal pleasures of laughter. Humouring Men will pursue a very explicitly feminist methodology that represents the critical voices of women to interrogate the gendered politics of texts. These novels do not merely indulge men's sense of entitlement, but they also co-opt women's participation in their own subjugation. So this book will be really, really vital, I think, especially for seeing how women are reproduced as the feminist killjoy, impolite, unattractive and powerless when we try to critique male power. I wonder how many of us feel seen already. So other work that Dr. Barr is undertaking that we will all want to look at is the digital project he's been working on with Dr. Justin Tonra of NUIG. I don't know if you're there, Justin, on Ossian Online, where many people can access the TEI encoded versions of Macpherson's work. And some of the work that Dr. Barr is undertaking in the monograph is shortly forthcoming with 18th century fiction, and that will be an article entitled Richardson Fiction, Women's Raillery, and Heteropessimist Humour. So I think this session is going to be as much therapy as intellectual fodder, and I hand over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Kerry, and it's really nice to see you here and kind of hear another Northern Irish voice talking about 18th century matters. And I'm really grateful for everyone tuning in at a very fraught and busy time for all of us. So in 2018, I stayed up late in Ireland. Let me see if I can share this. Okay. In 2018, I stayed up very late in Ireland, streaming the testimony of Republican Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, along with over 20 million viewers in America. Kavanaugh, Trump's nominee, is answering allegations, let's see if that works, of historic sexual assault by Professor Blasey Ford, a professor of psychology. Following on from Blasey Ford's cool, compelling account, Kavanaugh took centre stage to defend himself. The tableau conveying traditional authoritative masculinity, Kavanaugh was flanked by female representatives of domestic stability. His wife, Ashley Estes Kavanaugh, and of political power, Trump's counsellor, Kellyanne Conway. In what turned out to be an astonishingly detailed and digressive defence, Kavanaugh asserted intense feminine affinities, which supposedly precluded any possibility of violence to women, and a chorus of women's voices were marshalled on his behalf. A self-described liberal feminist provided a mantra of his character. See if I can scroll across here. Excuse me, there we are. Which nearly brought him to tears. You're a good man, a good man, good man. And then, in conclusion, came a remarkable avocation. As to sex, said Kavanaugh, this is not a topic I ever imagined would come up at a judicial confirmation hearing, but I want to give you a full picture of who I was. I never had sexual intercourse or anything close to it during high school, or for many years after that. In some crowds, I was probably a little outwardly shy about my inexperience. I tried to hide that. But at the same time, I was also inwardly proud of it. For me, and for the girls who I was friends with, that lack of major rampant sexual activity was a matter of faith and respect and caution. So this claim to long-standing male virginity was, I think, a showstopper. It was a statement designed to quell objections and allegations. Yet while Kavanaugh aligned his morals with feminine niceness, his mode of articulation was nonetheless choleric. His modesty sounded like pride. The object of its rage was nonetheless a woman. This audacious claim, I think, made male chastity the bedrock of the good man and the bedrock of the heroic lawgiver. The chronological and confessional difference aside, Kavanaugh's self-description reverberated with me with a particular literary precedent. In Samuel Richardson's Sir Charles Grandison of 1754, A History of a Good Man, this novel labours to glamorise the potency of its male virgin and to confirm his patriarchal power. If Richardson's Clarissa endeavours to prove that a reformed rake makes the best husband or the worst husband, Grandison argues that a man virgin makes the best husband. So in this novel, Richardson attempted to make the good man the glory of his sex and to fix virginity as an integral part of moral masculinity. But such attempts to reascribe gendered virtues are, I think, inevitably a litmus test of social mores and ideological identities. Thus, in the 20th century, Terry Eagleton dismissed Grandison in a single paragraph, perceptively arguing that in the novel, the tide of feminization was recuperated by patriarchy. Eagleton, I think, very wisely noted that by depicting a chaste, powerful Christian hero, Richardson's work attempted no less than the production of a new kind of male subject. But what I think is particularly interesting about Eagleton's evaluation is that despite the positive evaluation of its sexual politics, it's Sir Charles's chastity that prompts a particularly acerbic dismissal. And you can see here the quote from Eagleton, where Grandison is attributed in giving this kind of massive strike on the patriarchal double standard. Richardson, Eagleton says, show how such chastity is equally essential for men. And here is Eagleton's main critique. But the blunt truth, he says, is that in a patriarchal society, it does not matter whether men are chaste or not. Grandison's virginity has no price, no exchange value. Unlike Clarissa, he is not a commodity on the sex or property market. His virtue is no more than a personal affair, nobody's business but his own. So here, Eagleton swiftly forecloses the radical possibilities of the novel through an energetic denunciation of its protagonist's virginity. So Charles comes out here as a prig, a coxcomb, but most importantly, as a merely domestic man. And I think here what we see is a political critic being repulsed by a male protagonist whose virtues too closely resemble the chaste heroine of Christian drama. Man virgin causes gender trouble. For Eagleton, I think that idea that a man's virtue, that being nobody's business but his own, draws attention to the machinery of silence that has long made men's sexuality reassuringly irrelevant. But I think it is precisely by making Sir Charles's virtue a prime commodity for the reading public that Richardson's novel attempts its transformation of sexual mores. Now, in the wake of Me Too, men's virtue is everybody's business, and Grandison is more relevant than ever. But Richardson's novel, I think, is also instructive, and pessimistically so, about the ways in which the renovation of male virtue and the fashioning of male chastity rests upon an impressive ambience of moral misogyny. In this way, I argue, the elevation of the good man entails not merely an appropriation of culturally feminized virtues, but also it entails the programmatic depreciation of women. Richardson, as we probably know, had previously trialled a kind of beta version of the good man in his previous novel. And that's Mr. Hickman, who was Anna Howe's suitor. But for poor old Mr. Hickman, he was so sort of a good man His decency cancelled out any heterosexual dynamism with a kind of comic incapacity. Hickman's goodness is as antiquated and as unappealing as his dress sense. So Anna talks about how, despite his good family, his good estate, the fact he's of a good social standing, sober and modest, she cannot love the man, nor ever shall. For he is, she says, so generally meek. When I rate him, he seems to be so naturally fitted for rebuke, and so much expects it, that I know not how to disappoint him, whether he just then deserve it or not. I am sure he has puzzled me many a time, when I have seen him look penitent for faults he has not committed, whether to pity or to laugh at him. I think Anna's objections here are a prospectus of the difficulty of fashioning a modern virgin, whose goodness is not outmoded or visibly passive. And the playful perversity of female desire is here disappointed by meek availability. Grandison avoids such pitfalls by having its hero or heroine, Harriet Byron, fall in love with the superlatively moral, omni-attractive Sir Charles when he is already attached, already taken to the beautiful and good Clementina della Porretta, who is nonetheless unfortunately Catholic. So we have here an instance of the hero's textual scarcity driving up his erotic value. For hundreds of pages, his divided heart wavers between the two women, the English Harriet and the Catholic Clementina, until he finally settles on the thoroughly English, and by now thoroughly ground down and pathetically grateful Harriet. But even then, the stimulations of romantic unavailability are insufficient to fully neutralize the social skepticism around manly chastity. And Richardson's attempt to crowdsource examples of manly goodness from everyone, including 14-year-old boys, which I think is pretty desperate. This is him writing to the 14-year-old William Lobb. He says, I'm faced with the difficulty of drawing a good man that the ladies will not despise and the gentlemen laugh at. And all of these attempts suggest a kind of intrinsic, almost intractable problem. That is, the need to defend the man virgin against men's derision and women's contempt. So what we have in the novel is a kind of narrative solution to this problem, which discreetly conceals the fact of its hero's virginity deep in the narrative. So this is a virtue hinted at rather than proclaimed in the title page. So the first two volumes of the novel emphasize repeatedly Sir Charles's virility, wealth, and prestige. It is not until the fifth volume that Sir Charles's sister Charlotte confines the surprising fact to his would-be wife Harriet. And she says to Harriet, "The man is virtuous, even as I believe to chastity. But don't let the ladies around you, nor the gentlemen neither, hear this grace supposed to be my brother's. Nobody about us shall for me. I would not have my brother made the jest of one sex and the aversion of the other, and be thought so singular a young man." So Charlotte's works here actually rehearse and recapitulate Richardson's own worries, making explicit his nervousness that such a virtue risks alienating readers. But in a culture which views heterosexual experience as a precondition of mature masculinity, Sir Charles's virginity is a disconcerting oddity, which potentially effeminizes or even queers his gentlemanly mastery. And this almost revelation, because it's not quite explicit, comes at a strategic point in the narrative, where a veritable centrifuge of desire has been established around the hero. His superlative attractiveness is affirmed by not merely the love of two exemplary women, but entire families. I mean, this is a kind of a kinship adoration that Richardson details. The hero's virginity is effectively given 3 volumes of compensatory narrative prophylaxis to protect him against derision. And as a result, we get this kind of strange kind of hymenal sense of his persona. His outward conformity to the world is balanced by an impenetrable self-sufficiency. And again, this is Charlotte. She talks about the ways in which he will not quarrel with the world, and he will not make compliances with it, as would impeach his honour or conscience. My brother is valued, he says, by those who know him best, not so much for being a handsome man, not so much for his birth and fortune, nor this nor that single worthiness, as for being, in that great and comprehensive sense of the world, a good man. He lived to himself and to his own heart. And I think it's very interesting the way in which that comprehensive term that we heard in Kavanagh's testimony, that term, a good man, resonates. And Harriet confides again what Miss Grandison means by good. She calls her brother a good man. But I and you, another correspondent, Lucy, would understand by the world. So a good man is fashioned between female intimates. It is women who encode virtues and recognise what is, in effect, a kind of masculine ideal, something that's defying, as it were, a contrast with a hostile world. There's much that made of the ways in which the good man is distinct from modern men who pay their court by the exterior appearance rather than interior worth. That is, the good man is like a woman, private, modest, eschewing ostentation, a full subject. And yet the strange thing is that Grandison's virginity is no secret at all in a novel of compulsive frankness and epistolary exhibitionism. Instead, what the explicit confession of his chastity invites the reader to do is to join in the correspondent's discreet approval. Thus, we as readers preserve Sir Charles's reserve. We keep his modesty, his aura of purity. We become complicit in this economy of blushes saved. I think what's interesting, given the kind of feminine labour to make the male hero, is that what emerges is not a feminist hero. Grandison indeed offsets any potential for collateral feminisation through a system of structural misogyny and a vein of male anger. Again, I think back to Kavanaugh. The hero's chastity is thus a triumph of discipline, a redirection of competition and pride. So he's a hero who's naturally passionate, who has pains to keep his passion under. And his flaws, I think, are symptomatically those of anger and choler. He has, quote, a quick temper, pride and passion, which require the utmost caution and vigilance to rein in. He is not naturally a timid man. So what we have here is a sense of heterosexual charisma coasting on barely contained rage. Achieved against personal propensities to sensuality, Sir Charles's self-mastery provokes women's desire, even as it demands their shame as a kind of guarantor of attraction. And Richardson's novel deploys what it calls femalities, that is, women's whimsical desires and imaginations, to fashion the good man. It binds those female characters into an economy of adulation driven by the relentless production of their own inferiority. So we see that with Harriet, whose nascent love is coterminous with an eroticized self-consciousness. She writes, all this virtue is centered in the one good man. What then have I to be ashamed of? And yet I'm a little ashamed now and then for all that. Kind of peculiar confession. So the novel's erotic energy simultaneously exalts its object and lowers, if not debases, the women who dwindle as they magnify the good man. This gendered exemplarity thus coasts on a wave of felt female fallibility. I think what is unusual, perhaps, is the way in which this diminished sense of female self is arguably part of the novel's conception. Writing to Richardson during Grandison's composition, Irish clergyman Philip Skelton urged the author to create as good a fine gentleman as a Christian can be. It's kind of interesting. Moreover, Skelton counselled that a good man will be out of nature if he is not persecuted. He will not be a very good man if the world does not give him this testimony. And Skelton demands that Richardson also give him, in the novel, a bad woman, expensive, imperious, lewd, and at last a drama, of course, the worst of all, a female drunkard. And he says this is a fruitful and necessary subject, which will strike and entertain to a miracle. You are already so safe with the sex, and nothing you can say of a bad woman will hinder you from being a favourite. So male virtue here cannot shine sufficiently without the involvement of female defect. Manly virtue will always be tested and persecuted by adversity. In Skelton's outline, Richardson's earned impunity licenses him to delineate women's flaws. If both Pamela and Clarissa provide ample bad women, Grandison trumps them both with immoral mothers, lustful women, disobedient wives, dipsomaniacal stepmothers, and violent female stalkers in space. So if female frailty is indispensable to catalyse male virtue, a hero's perfection also creates an ambient inadequacy, even those who are relatively good. As a magistrate, Sir Charles is not merely an improvement on Mr. B, but he is a figure whose innate virtue prompts spontaneous self-incrimination. When he summons his sister Charlotte to account for an illicit passion, Harriet hopes that the interview will indicate fault in what she calls this almost perfect brother. But she notes that Charles's justice is a severe thing. And who can bear a trial, she says, if the integrity and greatness of this man's heart is to be the rule by which their actions are to be examined? And I think as an exacting lawgiver, Sir Charles's upright heart and pure holds those around him to a painful standard. And this moral muscularity has, I think, a particularly Miltonic flavour. And Grandison's rethinking of male virginity is refracted at key points through Miltonic allusion. As Gillian Beer notes, both authors attempt systematic Christianising of the literary. For both, chastity as moral state and as integrity is absolute. Indeed, Harriet humorously imagines Sir Charles as a kind of improved Adam who would disrupt Milton's theodicy. Unlike his uxorial forebear Adam, he would not have been so complacent to Eve as Milton makes Adam. For Sir Charles, he says, would have had gallantry enough to his fallen spouse to make her regret her lapse, but he would have done his own duty and left it to the Almighty to have annihilated his first Eve and given him a second. If, as Bonnie Latimer has noted, this raises a quiet alarm, or perhaps quite a loud alarm, about Sir Charles's insistent will to power, I think it is Harriet's self-deprecating acceptance of her role as a second best, second Eve, which really shocks the reader. If Richardson's fantasy of male authority might seem unexceptional in 18th century terms, I think recent accounts of its collaborative construction illuminate the degree to which Sir Charles is co-created by the work of women. In 1751, Richardson writes to his French translator de Freville to say that he is teased by a dozen ladies of note and virtue to give them a good man, as they say that I have been partial to their sex. And these demands are confirmed by Catherine Talbot, who describes herself and Elizabeth Carter in her correspondence as two Pygmalionesses who supplied traits of his good man's character, which Richardson has then combined with his own work to form Sir Charles Grandison. And in that correspondence, Grandison is figured as the product of a heterosexual clandestine meeting. Carter promises to Richardson that she shall keep what she calls this affair a secret, for all your readers are so very impatient that if it were known Sir Charles were in town, there would be much scratching and clawing. In Carter's playful account, her intimate relationship with the book protects it from an audience of over-enthusiastic women keen to get their paws on him. And recent archival work by Natasha Simonova on the Grey family correspondence suggests that female participation in Richardson's final novel may be much greater than previously thought. So if Grandison depreciates the women characters who write its hero into existence, and it also assimilates women collaborators into its authorial imprimatur, I think the form of its man virgin has a peculiarly extractive quality. The exploitative tendencies of Sir Charles, the heterosexual paragon, I think become queasily visible in a later work, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. In St. John Rivers, the allure of austerity is combined with an explicit demand for the annihilation of female subjectivity. And I think Bronte is at pains to illuminate how the fetishization of male exemplarity requires and rests on female self-sacrifice to both empower and to legitimate its expansive logic. If Harriet Byron lives out her sentence of inferiority in the domestic confines of Colnbrook, Jane Eyre herself is threatened with being sublimated into the punishing labour of St. John Rivers' colonial mission. So, not simply a foil to Rochester, St. John Rivers' very real sexual magnetism is animated, I think, by his virginity. Jane remarks what she calls his strictly restrained zeal, compressed, condensed, controlled. The heart was thrilled, the mind astonished by the power of this preacher. While Grandison's enamoured family of love renders the agonies of inferiority supportable through a kind of collective toil, Bronte's novel imagines marital relation as a condition of suffocating intensity. Both Sir Charles and St. John produce a similar sense of inadequacy in their second Eves. Harriet's discomfort at her relative imperfection resonates, I think, with Jane's sense of inexpressible sadness on hearing her cousin sermonizing. But Jane, unlike Harriet, locates the fault not in herself, but in the clergyman, sensing in him what she calls the turbid dregs of disappointment, impulses of insatiate yearnings and disquieting aspirations. So if Grandison is at pains to praise the pragmatism of second-place love, such renunciation threatens to bear monstrous fruit in Bronte's fiction. Made of the material from which nature hews her heroes, she says, of St. John Rivers, her lawgivers, her statesmen, her conquerors, nonetheless, Jane Eyre's Christian hero is exposed as an unnatural tyrant. But that does not mean his tyranny is not tempting. Indeed, Jane says that she could imagine the possibility of conceiving an inevitable, strange, torturing kind of love for him because he is so talented, and there is often a certain heroic grandeur in his look, manner, and conversation. But she recognises that in that case her lot would become unspeakably wretched. He would not want me to love him, and if I showed the feeling, he would make me sensible that it was a superfluity, unrequired by him, unbecoming in me. I know he would. And yet, St. John is a good man, said Diana. He is a good and a great man, says Jane, but he forgets pitilessly the feelings and claims of little people, pursuing his own large views. It is better, then, the insignificant to keep out of his way, lest in his progress he should trample them down. The Bronte's novel, I think, deconstructs the ways in which the good man depresses rather than liberates female selfhood. Love, female love in particular, becomes a kind of surplus value that can be harnessed to a colonial project. Rather than detracting from St. John Rivers' moral power, his unimpeachable integrity and his zeal, his violent zeal for Christian good, enables a relentless self-belief. While Jane may escape the lacerating attention of St. John Rivers, his annihilating exemplarity continues to haunt the text. In a century which fetishized female virtue and virginity then, I think the figure of the male virtue offered a uniquely reactionary way of retrenching patriarchal authority in a fashion that actively sought to diminish women's cultural power. Thus, Grandison weaponizes male virginity against the encroachments of a feminization ironically previously advanced by Richardson himself. For all its fair sex crowdsourcing, Grandison commandeers virginity for its hero solely by depreciating the femalities who sponsor his rise. And while Richardson writes in the heyday of libertinism, we read now in the age of the incel, a moment where male rage at involuntary celibacy has become, quote, an excuse for mass violence. And as Erin Spaminato has argued, the incel, I think, is a product of literary culture, which, to quote her, treats the topic of male sexual frustration as if it is of prime importance to us all. An avatar of a supposed crisis in masculinity, the incel crystallizes anger at heterosexual privilege denied. But in their grandstanding, their assumption of roles of moral authority, and their near contempt for the women they deign to marry, these voluntary celibates likewise exude resentment and a sense of embattled and persecuted manhood. Kavanaugh's public profession of virginity is merely another episode in the ways in which the gendering of virtue can become a war.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Thank you. Shall we take to the chat to register our appreciation for an extraordinary paper that ranged so widely across centuries and literary forms and cultures, and that showed us, I think, all new things about the culture in which we now live and move and have our being, as well as the one in which Richardson operated. So thank you very, very much. And I can see lots of people taking to the data. It's one of the worst things about this digital medium, that what we need now is a kind of rousing round of applause. But I hope that the chat will at least offer some kind of substitute. I think what I might do is just to take down the slide so that we can see you a little bit bigger. Let me take that down. Okay, so I wonder whether people have responses to that paper, and perhaps questions. There are two ways in which you can ask a question. So either you can write in the chat that you have a question. You can indeed write your question in the chat if you would like to. Or down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see four little circular icons, and the one on the right is a person with their hand up. And if you click on it, then it will allow you to raise your hand and ask a question or give a response. So I wonder whether there's anybody who would like to come in first of all. I'm going to give people a second, because sometimes it takes a little while for me to spot that people have their hands up or that they're asking questions. Okay, I can see. So Helen Dallas, can I invite you either to take off your unmute your microphone, so you can do that down at the bottom, and you can share your camera if you'd like to do that, or pop your question into the chat if that's better. Let me have a look. I can see.
I'm trying to share video, see if it works. Can you hear and see me?
We can certainly hear you. We can nearly see you, I think. There we are. We can see you now. That's fantastic.
Hearing's amazing. Thank you so much for that talk. I was really interested. This comes as being a huge fan of Clarissa. I was really interested in what you were saying about Hickman as a prototype of Charles Grandison. Partly because I read Hickman as a sort of alternative model of a sort of fantasy of female dominance and control, almost, that like Clarissa fantasy with Lovelace is that she can change him into being a better man, and then actually maybe we should look to Anna, who's rejected Hickman, but actually she will get to have a control over him, and that's very sexy, and therefore she should like that. I wondered about how those two things sat with each other. I mean, I was really interested in what you were saying about the metatextual female control of Charles Grandison, but how that didn't really come through in the character, and it just more about Hickman and Grandison really interested me.
I haven't actually thought about the fact of Hickman as a kind of fantasy of control, but it does make sense. But I suppose the thing about Anna is that part of her is resistant to the idea that she might be the person who would be in control. And there's that kind of playing with what one might desire that I find really interesting in the way in which she talks about Hickman. So that actually her idea of erotics is that she's kind of trying to look for something that might be a more dynamic power relation, and it's not. I'm not sure Hickman is sufficiently sexy, if I can say that in a kind of Q&A forum for Anna. And I was thinking about Claire Jarvis's work, Exquisite Masochism, where she talks about these kind of moments of kind of forestalled sexual contract as being the most exciting and titillating, particularly in Victorian and 19th century novels. But what I find really interesting is that I think we're seeing something similar to that in Grandison, where women kind of agree to transactionally commute their control to a male figurehead who may or may not abuse said control in a way that kind of allows them to amplify and magnify their sense of what is good for a collective. So I think deciding to love Sir Charles Grandison is a kind of rational act. But it's also an act of fantasy as well, in which I think they construct him. John Mullen calls him an effect of feminine awe, which I think is a good way of thinking about this. But that he, I think, in some ways allows them to articulate their version of a moral society. But it's one in which they hand over the power. And that's what I'm really interested in. That part of it seems to be this, peculiarly masochistic urge to give over moral authority to somebody who would be punitive to the people who have kind of elected them, as it were, their kind of moral representative. So it's that kind of strange, this was erotic contract that I find really interesting in both Clarissa, but definitely in Grandison.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen. Are there other questions? I can see 4 hands up, but my computer's being slow and not letting me see who has hands up. Hang on a second. Let me go over to my chat. Oh, fantastic. Helen Moody, may I ask you either to unmute your microphone or to put your question in the chat? It would be great. Thank you.
Did you call me?
I don't know how to unmute my microphone. Do you see me?
We can certainly hear you. We can certainly hear you. Absolutely.
Okay. I don't know how to do chat. I just want to make a remark about a common, very popular hero today that I'm somewhat addicted to. An Outlander. The great sexual hero, his name is Jamie. We are startled to discover when it's time for him to marry Claire that he's a virgin.
Ooh.
And he's actually not ashamed of it all that much. He's rather proud of it. He says he's not. He's kissed women, and it's not that he doesn't know women, but he is a virgin. And what the program does is it crowdsources around him all these various virtues you've mentioned for Sir Charles. He's beloved by his kin. He has tremendous amounts of masculine virtues. He's not a disciplinarian or punitive, but he is a virgin. When he discovers in another book his daughter has been raped, he takes on very male attitudes towards rape. He can be very violent. He's hot-tempered. He has quite a number of the characteristics that you've mentioned for Sir Charles. And the second one I want to mention is that the next generation, the next young man, he's not a virgin, but he is chaste, and he doesn't want to have sex with the girl, Brianna, until they actually marry. And both of them are presented as good men. I think it's very interesting. The key characters in these two, in this very popular series, are virgins. He does have a homoerotic component. There's a homoerotic, very evil man, Jack Randall, and then there's a homosexual good man, John Gray, and they both fall in love with Jamie too. He doesn't quite refuse to have sex with them. In fact, he's raped in a very powerful, cruel way by the bad man. And I'm just bringing up that this is a very popular series, very unexpected, and it's emphasized and it fits into your thesis. Okay, that's what I want. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you so much. I've only watched 1 episode of Outlander. I couldn't stick with it, but that's fantastic and really interesting. And I think that, I think that kind of omni attraction that Sir Charles has is crucial. That he's, even if he doesn't court a kind of homoerotic gaze, he certainly, men want to be him. They kind of think that he's kind of wonderful. So that's terrific. Thank you.
Let me say, not to justify it, but there are now 2 academic books on the series.
No.
Is there, and they actually tried it. They were going to have an academic conference, and the pandemic got in their way. But the academic conference was about the homoeroticism and the homosexuality in the series. No lesbians. But it's very interesting sexually. Okay, enough from me. Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. Okay, I'll try and okay, now I'm gone. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. That was wonderful. Carolyn Williams, can I ask you to ask your question? By all means, share your camera if you'd like to, but you don't have to at all.
Like that?
Just like that. That's perfect.
Oh, well, yeah. Just going to say, what about the traditional early modern idea that men who were excessively keen on sex were effeminate?
Absolutely. So what I had to kind of eviscerate from this paper is a whole kind of section on Milton, but also ideas of effeminacy. Exactly. So kind of overweening affinity with women being a kind of effeminizing force, and balancing that. So the kind of preamble to Sir Charles is actually a discussion of Milton's self-fashioning in the Apology to Spectimnus, where he talks about, he's called, the Domina, the mistress of Christ. And it's this kind of reclaiming of chastity and kind of femininity as a kind of muscular moral trait. And it's a very interesting, I think, kind of decision to kind of formulate a kind of self-persona, which is all about things that have been mocked by other men and seen as kind of effeminate qualities, and turning them into instead a kind of claim for superior moral authority. So the Miltonic kind of preamble is where I kind of did that work. But you're absolutely right. That kind of that affinity with kind of women becomes a kind of a feminizing trait. Absolutely.
Oh, and could I just add, for Ellen Moody's benefit, that if you look at the two source novels for Outlander, if you look at The Flight of the Heron and its sequel, both of which of course were written by a woman, they're both seen through the eyes of male narratives who clearly, a male narrator who clearly has some kind of a thing for Ewan Cameron, who is the original inspiration for the Highlander anyway.
Thank you for developing the conversation. Sarah Hammerschmidt, can I ask you to either unmute or type out your question, whichever suits you better?
Hi, morning from Arizona. Rebecca, thank you so much for really fascinating and important talk. It resonates really well with some of the work that I think I've seen in the last few years, the Richardson Society roundtables and other work on Me Too and Grandison and Richardson. So I think that's really really important work. I was wondering whether you're familiar with Richardson's exchange with Lady Bradshaw in letters as he's writing Grandison and trying to figure out how would I write this good man. Lady Bradshaw has a very specific take on it, and she said, well, great, he has to be moral, but she keeps arguing for what she calls the dress and address of a moderate rake, that he should have some kind of, he should be a bit exciting. And I was wondering how that would, and of course, Richardson's like, oh God, no. And I was wondering how you would you relate that to what you were saying today about the figure of Grandison as it's eventually written.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Lady Bradshaw kind of, I think he does, even if he does say, oh God, no, I think he does respond collaboratively to that kind of suggestion, and an awful lot of work is being done on him as a kind of Christian rake. Elaine McGeer has written really well on Grandison, incorporating that kind of rakishness. But what I see happening here is something slightly different, which is that what we might think of as moral and sexual control becomes the kind of the exercise of power. He got points where, with Miss Mansfield and others, he kind of behaves in a very kind of paternalistic way. He can flirt. His flirting is all about dominance. It's not necessarily about allowing women their power play. I mean, there's always that kind of very tight control of what is going on. So I don't think Grandison is purely a refashioning of the rake, and I think it's more a repurposing of these kind of self-disciplining, assertive powers of the male virgin that he's thinking of, and that these are being enshrined into kind of culturally attractive traits. But when he does use those kind of, as you say, dress and address of the rake, I think they're recoded in very deliberate ways to answer and reprove that desire in women. And I think it is about reproving that desire, that we don't want to collaborate with that entirely. What we want to do is we want to refashion, we want to discipline your desires for that rate. And what you ought to desire, that kind of strong arming of fantasy into something that is actually a kind of a chaste man. Of course, Sir Charles is a man who will always be a virgin, that's the plan. That is the kind of fetish which is to be pursued by women in their, I think, their collaborative endeavour to create a kind of moral community. They are being tasked with reshaping their desires in order to make a kind of moral community in which people are treated better But unfortunately, women take the hit because they get treated I think quite harshly. But you know, take the hit and you make a better society. I think the novel argues for that moral enterprise. So, yeah, thank you. Great, that was a great question.
Thank you both for that. Carol Stewart, can I invite you to unmute and ask a question?
I hope I've done that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. I don't know if you can see me. I've got my camera on. First of all, thanks to Rebecca for a really fascinating paper. That was great. I really enjoyed that, and it's connecting with some of the things that I'm thinking about and trying to write about at the moment. I don't know if perhaps you've already answered this question in a way, but I was wondering, what was the problem that Sir Charles Grandison resolved, or maybe didn't resolve, for Richardson? I mean, if you think of him as a reviser, his own work, you know, is a revision of Pamela, Grandison is a revision of Clarissa. And I wondered just what you would think about that. And I'm also wondering how it was that heterosexuality for a man had to be detached from agency in some way. Is there some kind of connection going on there? So anyway, those are my broad, rather vague questions.
Okay, I really, can I answer the last question first? I'm not sure I can. That's a fantastic way to put it. Heterosexuality detached from agency. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think the last thing I wrote, not this paper, but the one that's coming out with 18th century fiction, is thinking about that. And it's not that heterosexuality is detached from agency, but I think that Richardson's female characters articulate what is called the kind of heteropessimist idea of heterosexuality, which is that their sexual orientation is heterosexual, but they don't believe that heterosexuality is really good for them.
Yeah.
But of their sexual orientation and the social structure and the marital relation, all these things that they are kind of committed to via either innate desire or by kind of, you know, social construction, that it's not necessarily in their best interests. So I don't think that it's detached from agency, but there's a kind of resignation almost, or a kind of acceptance that, you know, you fall in love with a good man, and what you get is kind of a mitigation of yourself. You give up something, and it might not be agency, but it might be your best happiness. It might be the man who says, "You're the first love of my life," or "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." He might say something like, "Well, you're pretty good," or, you know, "Clementina wore that dress nicer." So this kind of, I think, comparative sense of kind of, deflated happinesses. I think the novel's really interested in second best. So that's a fantastic formulation. And your first question was about Richardson
revising, yeah, Pamela, and then Grandison revising Clarissa.
So what I also think is happening is that Richardson's kind of writing Pamela, or rewriting or revising Pamela too, very close to the composition of Grandison. And actually, whilst Hickman is really important as a kind of trial run of what the good man might look like, but Richardson does him for comedy, I think, more than anything else. I think Hickman is a kind of a ludicrous figure. I think Sir Charles is actually much closer to the reformed Mr. B than he is to the Hickman in many ways. Because, you know, in Pamela too, Pamela in her exalted condition, Mr. B is a kind of more authoritative figure. He's a more mature person. And I think Richardson is thinking through what a kind of marital relation might look like with somebody who is now a better person, who has apparently been reformed to an extent.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually revising Mr. B in his second iteration. That's what I think anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matthew Sangster, can I invite you to unmute and turn your camera on if you want?
Okay, I'm trying to appear. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that really great talk. I just had a quick question about this idea of the second Eve. I was wondering whether Lilith was ghosting this at all, because there's the sort of, it's more a 19th century tradition than something that appears to be active in the 18th century, but the idea that Adam has a first wife, will not submit to him, who's replaced with Eve, so Eve is already the second Eve in that sense. I wonder whether that was going on in the discourse we were talking about.
I don't know, and is that Lilith you're thinking of?
Yes.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that, so that is a kind of a wonderful and sudden thought that I'm going to have to think about. I'm not sure I can answer it, but that in itself is really interesting. I don't know if I mean, do you have any thoughts, Matt?
Not really. It just occurred to me that the parallel was there in biblical sources, but in bits eliminated as apocryphal. So there was some sort of, and I have a feeling that it's more of a 19th century reclamation or obsession than 18th century. So it was just really to point that out, and if there was anything that you knew about the 18th century reception there. But
John, but I'll look it up because it's actually really suggestive. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Kathleen Luby, can I ask you to unmute?
Yes. Hi, thank you. It's hi from New York. It's such a pleasure to hear this talk, Rebecca. It was wonderful. It went a long way toward explaining for me the whether we like it or not, the kind of sexiness of Harriet's and everyone else's attraction to Charles. And so I really appreciate kind of that, again, whether we want to or not, we have to attribute an erotics to this persistent virginity, right, and all of its attractions, and also its performance of its own attractions as beneficence and so on and so forth. And I guess my question has to do with how it helps us see other characters in the novel. So I'm thinking that in some ways the inverse of this is Charlotte and her husband, right, who as readers, I think at least today, we think she has to just, it's like a bitter pill that she has to generate desire, and she becomes pregnant. So we know that somehow this happens. Yeah, but there's, I mean, heteropessimism might go some way toward explaining it, but he performed, I'm not sure if you'd call it effeminacy, but his effeminacy and her just constant ridicule of it brings a very different, I guess, definition of erotics into play. So I wondered if you had thoughts about that.
So read my forthcoming article, which is like actually a lot about Charlotte G and her husband. And you're absolutely right, you know, a lot of Lord G's kind of attributes are kind of coded as kind of effeminacies, his love of China, his interior decoration, you know, he likes old women, hangs out with them. And so, you know, but Charlotte's kind of very, yeah, she's good at ridicule. And so a lot of that is, you know, yeah, a kind of a heteropessimist kind of bent. I mean, I find it really hard to kind of to see Charlotte and her husband's marriage as anything other than a disciplining of her wayward desire. And I know there's much to kind of say for her agency, but I think that the novel overwhelmingly, you know, suggests that this is really her second best. But she has to take second best because she's a woman. And I think that kind of the sense in which, you know, she gives over that marital choice to her brother and he makes the decision for her. He chooses her husband. He tells her that now is the time for her to get married. So that kind of agency is really, I think, performatively taken out of her hands. Like she has to perform her obedience. And that, again, I think is part of the sexual erotics of it, in that, you know, there's a very good, I think it's Chris Rolston essentially says that Charlotte's in love with her brother. That part of her is really attracted to him. Nobody measures up to the one man she can't marry. The one man who she's the only woman in the whole of the novel who takes her brother to task, who you know, argues with him convincingly, who is pert and smart and witty enough to really show him up as a bit of a prig. And she's the one woman who cannot marry him. And I think you know, it says something about the way in which even sibling of Sir Charles Grandison has to be erotically enamored of him as a male love object, about the ways in which this novel is invested in showing women what they ought to want and mostly can't have. So yeah, I think Sir Charles' relationship with Charlotte is really crucial.
Thank you. It's great.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And appropriately, we finished where we started with Kerry Sinanan. Do you want to unmute yourself, Kerry? Or maybe we don't. I think that might be a ghost hand up. Oh no, it is. No, Kerry.
Am I here now? Am I here?
You're here. Absolutely, you are. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks for squeezing me in. That was just all incredible and brilliant. So my question is really about asking if we should consider the imperial and geopolitical dimensions of all of this, because of course St. John Rivers, his chastity is reaching out to that imperial domination. But Rebecca, when you were charting the shift from the early modern via Milton to this very deliberate masculine reclaiming of chastity as a virtue, it made me think about placing that shift also in a geopolitical context. Of, you know, a lot of the vocabulary you're using are describe the impulses of empire, disciplining, self-fashioning, you know, but also the manufacture of desire along with that. And so, and then of course we end up with Brett Kavanaugh, and this is entirely about US global imperial domination and the role that chastity has on a global stage. So I just wonder if you could maybe say something about those more global dimensions of all of this.
I absolutely think so, and I think there's something. I think the shift from Grandison to Bronte is a really big one, but I think it makes explicit what's a latent, I think, in Grandison as a novel, which is that kind of Sir Charles being in a kind of circulating in a European fashion, but returning home to kind of ensure that kind of that there's no pollution, or you know, that he doesn't export his chastity elsewhere, that it returns to the domestic. And what I think is really interesting in Jane Eyre is the way in which Jane is really requested to sponsor the imperial project, to propel it, and that, you know, that the women's desire is supposed to kind of bring St. John Rivers and his Christianizing colonial mission, and to kind of move it out into realms. And that section I quoted where it talks about, you know, the little people who might impede his progress, I don't think that's just thinking in kind of terms of people at home in England. I think that's explicitly thinking about the ways in which that chaste, aggressively white supremacist body moves out into the kind of colonies and performs its work there. And the other bodies are collateral damage, because Jane is just one example of the collateral damage. And he goes off and he does, you know, sermonize and kind of work elsewhere on his mission. And I think that what's being invoked there is the spectral bodies of those who will be dominated by that kind of Christian-sponsored kind of imperial mission. His body and his particular form of sexuality is really geared up to perform. Yeah. Caroline Williams is saying, I suppose George's Protestantism is potentially empire building. It is, absolutely. Yeah.
That's a wonderful place to bring this to bring this part of proceedings to a close. But the wonderful thing about ODSECS is that the conversation can continue indefinitely. So there will be a recording of this seminar up on our YouTube channel very soon after this. Shall we take to the chat again to thank Rebecca Barr enormously for such a wonderful talk, for such thoughtfulness and generosity in answering questions and taking this conversation on to new places. It really was just an absolutely wonderful event and starting point of many more conversations, I'm sure. So thank you very much. As you can see from the chat, Rebecca, we are all hugely grateful for you. Thank you very much. We hope that you will be able to join us in a little over a month's time, when on the 18th of November, when we'll be hearing from Robbie Richardson of Princeton University, who'll be speaking to us under the title Sacred Medicine at Strawberry Hill, British Antiquaries and Indigenous Objects. And that promises to be a really exciting session. So please do sign up for that. I know that there were many people today who had difficulty in joining the session, and if that was you, I apologise. It would be really good to hear people's feedback about the format and about the tech, things that work, things that don't. So please do feel free to get in touch with me via the Twitter page or directly. And thank you all for being here, because this is about community, and it's about community building, and so we are very grateful to you all for coming, asking your questions, and being part of this enterprise. So thank you all very, very much indeed.
Thanks, Brett.